Welcome to VoterTorque podcast selection 23. This is episode 6 and today we're talking about issues. So with that in mind, Simon, how would you label the selection? If you were maybe a journalist who was responsible for calling the election something, what would you say it was?
No country for old white men.
I can see why you might think that. Suddenly that's a minority group.
Yeah.
For me, I think it's the election of the winter of discontent. I think that there's an undercurrent, or it's becoming not even so much of an undercurrent now, of disenfranchisement, I think, and frustration and in some respects anger.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is an angry, it's more than grumpy. You go around and talk to people, there's a complaint almost first up, unless you live in Melbourne, in which case people say, isn't it a nice day? But there is a lot of grumpiness about a lot of things, which I think is bordering on anger.
Yeah.
What's triggering it is different in different people, though. So should we explore those issues?
Yeah, we should. And look, when the parties are looking to have their top 3 policies or top 5, whatever, they're actually trying to monitor the feel of the public and making appeals to those. So if you look back about, I don't know, a few months ago, the media had already labelled this election the cost of living election.
Yeah. And
since then, other things have sort of rolled out. I think that people probably instinctively come back to that because they're feeling the pinch. Either they're paying more for their mortgage, interest rates have gone up, they're paying more for their rental if they're not a homeowner, and certainly the cost of food is becoming a real issue.
Yeah, so for some people, all of those things will be hitting home.
Yep.
And for others, like if you're mortgage free, you're still having to pay a lot for your kumara.
Yep.
So there'll be different pains for different people.
Yes,
but
$12 a kilo at the supermarket.
Yeah.
And I think then subsequently, in a search for a solution to the cost of living crisis, parties are attacking that in a raft of different ways. And so that's why we're seeing so much talk about a wealth tax, about a capital gains tax, which is off the table and then it's not and then it is again. And so I think that search for solutions is proving quite difficult for the parties.
Yeah, everyone's talking about cuts and redistribution in some way or another. But the mechanisms they're talking about are quite different, eh?
Yeah, that's right. And of course, when Chris Hipkins became Prime Minister at the start of the year, he immediately started talking about bread and butter and his favourite food being sausage rolls, in an attempt to say we're coming back to basics, and this is what you can expect to hear from us between now and the election.
Has he not seen the reports about carbs?
Yeah.
Fuel,
yes,
everything.
Yes, and really interesting that the government chose to add tax back onto fuel on the 1st of July, when leading into an election you might have thought that was political suicide.
Yeah. So there's a lot to the cost of living. We're going to do taxes in more detail later, eh?
Yes, I think we'll have a separate podcast on the wealth taxes. It's certainly worth investigating the different takes on that and what impact it might likely have.
I see the ACT Party has been surveying. They don't say who they've surveyed. I guess it's probably the people in their own orbit. But came up with some not unsurprising results.
So what did they say?
Yeah, so they said 35% of the respondents to their survey said co-governance was the number one issue.
The problem with co-governance is, I think, and this has been discussed, it means different things to different people. For some it means a partnership between Maori and Pākehā and actually having equal input into the process at every level. For others it's something much less intrusive.
Yep.
But nobody defines co-governance when they talk about it, and so it does inevitably lead on to talk of racism and division and separatism.
Yeah, there's no agreed vocabulary that I can see. I saw one commentator saying, look, at the end of the day, the treaty has 3 principles. One is the Crown can govern. The second one is Māori can keep rangatiratanga, which is basically control over their lands and treasures. And the third one is that Māori get all the rights and duties of being a British citizen. And there's a lot more talk about rights than duties, I think, going on at the moment.
Yeah, there is. And you can expect to hear a lot more from both National and ACT about co-governance as we get closer to the election.
Yeah. Well, their second question was, the second result was 26% saying the economy was the number one issue.
Yep, and that's not surprising if it was an ACT audience that was being canvassed. They do worry a lot more about the level of debt, as I do for my children and grandchildren. They're the people who are going to be responsible for paying back the huge change in debt position from a worsening perspective that we saw during COVID.
Yeah, and there's two elements to that debate too. One is what you spend your money on, but the other is how you gain it. So we've talked about tax. It's the revenue base, and then the spending. You can have good spending and bad spending, right? So yes, health, education, and so on and so forth. But if you've got a really inefficient government sector, and I know this is something particularly that ACT focuses on, then a lot of that money is wasted.
Yep.
But do you know, it's like advertising, do you know which 50% is wasted?
Very hard to determine where the waste is. But
Number 3, 22% crime.
Yep, and that certainly, since the cost of living election label was put in place, I think has become an emerging topic. And situations like the Auckland shooting recently just make those discussions more prominent because the issue is foremost in people's minds.
I think it's true that you've got to address the root causes of the behaviours that you see, the criminal behaviours, but it's intergenerational.
It is.
You still actually have to do something in the interim. So it's not either or, it's both and I'm just concerned that getting tough on crime, so to speak, where does that end? Well, let's go back to smacking kids, shall we? That might and public floggings. So you have to address the intergenerational issues.
Yes, it's definitely a two-pronged attack that's needed. It's much easier for political parties in the short political terms to think about how they do something here and now. So build new prisons, take the key and turn the lock and throw away the key. Those things are easier to focus on, much harder to find solutions to those really entrenched intergenerational problems that you're talking about.
Yeah. And fourth and final, 14% said cost of living was front of mind, and that ties in with the economy, so I don't think we need to go around that buoy again.
No, that's
today.
right.
Interesting topic which came up first in Bloomberg in a financial journalist podcast in March, which some of the mainstream media have just caught up with in the last week, is a term called excuseflation.
What do they mean by that?
So, well, if you imagine that the indicators of inflation is that it's peaked and going back down, but prices are still going up. If you go to the supermarket, you can see that for yourself.
Yep.
And what it actually means is that businesses will use an event that everyone knows about to justify putting up prices. And COVID's the classic example. All the supply chains are disrupted, but even if your supply chain was not disrupted, you can still blame COVID for the prices going up. There's bird flu or a shortage of grain, wheat, butter, doesn't matter what it is. There's a sector that will use that as an excuse to justify price increases, and in fact often people won't even challenge the price increase because they go, oh well,
it's what they're expecting.
It makes sense because that happened.
Yeah. I think it's been particularly hard since COVID for smaller businesses because many of them have held their prices, recognising that they want to keep that business. They don't want it to flee somewhere else. And so many, I think, have held prices for too long, and all of a sudden they've reached a crisis point themselves, and then the price goes up with a jump. So yes, I agree that there probably is something to the excuseflation, but it's not a very black and white problem, is it? There's lots of reasons why the prices have gone up. The problem is the prices never seem to come back, except for fruit and vegetables, which are seasonal and floods affect them, and once the crop comes online, the price will be lower. But for processed goods, for example, the price never seems to come back.
People voting in this election, what is the emotional driver, do you think? I'm thinking about, are they voting with a view to just sticking it up the current government because they've had enough of their current circumstances, and so they want them out to send a signal that we're really unhappy with you, without any real expectation that the incoming government will be any better? Or is there a Peter Pan sort of hope that magically the new government will be able to improve people's lives the day after the election? I think there's a certain naivety about that, but I do believe that exists in some quarters. Or is there a somewhat resigned, head down Matilda kind of thing about, well, we're going to send a clear signal to this government that we want them out because we don't like the way our lives are, but we don't have any real expectation that the incoming government has any money or any intent to really change our lives.
I think it's a mix of all of those things. And although we've talked about the polls already and how you mustn't look at just one poll, it's the trends that count, but you'd have to say this is the first election that I can remember where the small parties have had such prominence. And I think that's going to continue right through to the election. The bigger parties are struggling to get much higher than that mid-30 range, whereas in previous elections they've been up close, much closer and across 40. And so I think that voters are... You can never, no two voters are the same, but I think a lot of voters are looking for something a bit different that might see some real change this election.
Yeah, and of course if there was no threshold, we'd see New Zealand First, we'd see the New Conservatives and Top
all in Parliament and probably having quite a bit of influence, despite the fact that they're little. I think that's right. The other thing that is worth considering is we'll do another podcast, I think, closer into the election about issues again, because they do change as the election approaches, and we're seeing smaller parties roll out their policies now. They're talking a lot about the issues. The two big parties, National and Labour, are always very coy about making their big policy announcements this far out from election, and they want to hold those close because they're worried that the other side will steal those policy initiatives if they resonate with the public. So we've got quite a long way to go yet in terms of what solutions they might provide for the economy, and that includes taxation. Probably they'll be having a long, hard think about crime, because that does seem to be forefront in people's minds at the moment, and there may be other things. Winston Peters, of course, loves coming out at the last minute with his usually 3 things, but I think he's been holding 4 fingers up recently, so he must be going to have 4 initiatives, but he couldn't possibly say what they are yet, and he loves the element of surprise. So he's hoping that they will gain some traction, I think.
It's possible that it's just arthritis in the little finger.
Could be. Yeah.
We've seen the stealing of policy already. ACT came out with a tough on crime, particularly youth crime. National followed suit. They had their boot camps and they were going to do this and that, which were harder. Very similar. And Labour's caved in, having taken the intergenerational approach and tried to reduce a whole lot of traditional behaviours in justice and corrections, has come out and joined the party.
Yes, and they're trying to now out crime, National's crime policies.
Well, it's Laura. Laura Norder.
It's really a case of watch the space with issues, isn't it? So lots of things being talked about at the moment, but they're not necessarily the things that will be talked about a month out from the election. Yeah,
and if you've got issues, well, haven't we all? Send them in to us. We can talk about them, or any other questions you've got, and we'll pick them up either in a question series or in our future issues episodes.
So you can do that through our website, TorquePoint, TORQUE, torquepoint.co.nz. Or through our Twitter and LinkedIn comment mechanisms.
Yep, great.
Thanks, we'll talk to you soon.
Yep, I'm Simon Ewing-Jarvie.
And I'm Heather Roy.